So, good morning again. My name is Alejandro Sosnik. I'm from the Department of Material Science and Engineering of Technion in Haifa, Israel. And I will be chairing this session and also presenting the first talk. In this session, we will not take questions after each presentation. We have, let's say, 20-25 minutes after the end of the last presentation to discuss the different topics. And let me thank the organizers for giving us the chance to organize this session. So I would like to begin asking myself why we need a session on pediatric nanomedicine. What's different in the pediatric population that we need to consider this as a separate topic? And I hope that I will convince you, or we all convince you in this relatively small session in terms of the number of speakers, but not less important, that we need to think about the pediatric population and the use of tools in the nanomedicine toolbox in a different way. In the last 10 years, I was focused on poverty-related diseases. I was faculty member in Buenos Aires. I was working on HIV, tuberculosis, and then I combined this with the pediatric population, and I find at least two common characteristics between these two groups. And one of the characteristics is that they are not so profitable for the pharmaceutical market, and thus the number of research groups focusing on these topics is relatively small. But on the other hand, we have an ethical commitment to society to trying to improve the performance of drugs to treat, in this case, pediatric disease. So this is the idea of this session. I will not present results. I will give a very general overview of the topic, and then the next speakers will be discussing results. So let me begin by saying that children are not small adults or little adults, and this is something that the World Health Organization has been claiming for the last decade because they display different pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. So drugs that work well in adults not necessarily will work in the case of the pediatric disease. We see also differences in toxicity because the pediatric patients undergo a maturation of the different tissues and organs over the first years of life. And I will show you one specific example in the next minutes. And finally, we need to face psychological issues. Even from a philosophical point of view, the understanding of what's disease is different in children and adults. And even if we want to develop, for example, an innovative inhalatory drug delivery system, will the child be able to administer this as any adult? And we will need to train every patient appropriately. So there is consensus that pediatric treatment is not just taking an adult formulation, adapting or adjusting the dose to the body weight or body surface, or just crushing a tablet to make it a liquid. We need to look at this pediatric population in a different way and trying to improve the quality of the products that we develop. Just to give you a general idea of the fragmentation that we see in the pediatric market, and I say the word market because this is related also to the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is less compelled about trying to develop pediatric products. According to the ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization, the pediatric population comprises at least 5 different subpopulations with very unique features. And the question is, if we develop a pediatric product, are we focused on which one of them? The whole pediatric population or one specific? And this reduces even more the pharmaceutical market for a product that we will eventually develop. Let's come back to the maturation of the different tissues and systems. And this was taken from a review from a British group in London that works in pediatric pharmaceutics. And if we look at, for example, the gastric pH, if I ask you what's the gastric pH, you will tell me 2, 3, probably. But if we look at the pH profile in a child, it begins at 7. And if we look at the last period between 2 weeks and 2 years, the pH decreases gradually from neutrality to 2 to 3, reaching the values that we see in adults. So Can we develop, for example, a pH-responsive drug delivery system for oral administration that is based on our knowledge of gastric pH? Probably not. And here we have a very interesting list of points that we should need to address if we think about innovative drug delivery systems. What about patient compliance? In this table, we summarize not only the administration routes, but also the kind of formulations that we can develop. And patient compliance based on these subpopulations that I defined before. Moreover, in the newborns, we can find 2 new subpopulations. So, are we developing a product for which pediatric population? Is this for the whole pediatric population or for one of them? So, again, this has implications in the context of profitability and how pharmaceutical industries will be able to take our developments to the clinics. This global concern is something that has been around for the last decade. I mentioned that before. In 2007, the World Health Assembly of the WHO signed a resolution called Better Medicines for Children and launched the global campaign entitled Make Medicines Child-Size. And the idea was trying to promote the development of more efficient pediatric formulations. And putting this in the context of nanomedicine, the question is how we can exploit the tools that we have today to make pediatric treatments more efficient. And let me list or mention at least 3 initiatives that have been founded in the last decade or so. The first is the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development that is founded by the American government, and 2 European initiatives that are based in the UK, the European Pediatric Formulation Initiative and the Global Research in Pediatrics that tries to bring this idea worldwide. And there is consensus that we need to address these issues in a multidisciplinary and multisectoral way. We are aware that nanomedicines are a multidisciplinary field. But if we want to take any innovation in the field of pediatrics beyond the preclinical trials, we will need to indeed focus on these 2 aspects, multidisciplinary and putting or bringing together people from academia, industry, regulatory agencies, and also probably NGOs, because the funding is relatively limited. I should mention that the idea of nanopediatrics or pediatric nanomedicine is not something very new. It's probably 8 years old. And the first person talking about this was Professor Edward Maccabi at UCLA that was involved in the foundation of the nanopediatrics program in the Mattel's Children's Hospital at UCLA. And he edited this issue in pediatric research on nanopediatrics already 6 years ago. And more recently, we overviewed and reviewed the field, and we found that there are at least 2 focuses where activities in academia are being conducted. And these 2 focuses are being represented in this session in the next 2 presentations. They are cancer and infectious diseases. So I will let my colleagues to present this in the coming minutes. Now, regarding possibilities at the interface of pediatric treatment and nanomedicine, we have at least 3 areas where we can take advantage of nanomedicines. And these thumbs up or down are related to how we are doing in these different categories. In the first case, we have diseases that are similar in adults and children. And I am not talking about pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of different drugs, because there, indeed, we need clinical trials to demonstrate that the pharmacokinetics is appropriate and adjust the dose to the specific patient. But if I'm talking about HIV, for example, there's not much difference between HIV in children and adults in terms of the kind of pathogen that is generating the disease. Then we have a different category where the disease has the same title, for example, cancer. But if we look at pediatric cancer, the source is different, the pathophysiology is different, and thus the treatment is probably or will be probably different. Indeed, we cannot just take a drug that is used for glioblastoma in adults and apply it in, or administer that in a kid and expect for the same result. And finally, the pediatric population displays a unique group of diseases that is called rare diseases or congenital diseases that affect a very small number of patients. And there we are, I mean, in these first two, we are doing some work in this direction. In the first one, we are having some progresses. In the second, we are not doing so well, and nanomedicine is mainly undertaken by people working at the interface of preclinical and clinical investigation, those that, for example, develop new models of pediatric cancer. In the last one, we are not doing anything at all, and let me say that in many cases, the characterization of the disease is not conducted. So we are kind of far from trying to innovate in terms of drug delivery when we don't even know what the treatment would be. And the challenges that we face are not less important. We need to overcome market constraints. It's very difficult to convince a company to undertake a nanomedicine from preclinical to clinical trials. And it's even more complicated if we talk about the pediatric population, because the market is relatively small and very fragmented. About preclinical models, if we talk about cancer, for example, the preclinical models that we usually have available are for adults. And we need to develop new models for children, and Angel Carcaboso will be talking about this in the next presentation. And finally, we need to address clinical trials. That is a bottleneck. And if we talk about clinical trials, we need to decide whether to conduct preliminary clinical trials in adults or not, and this is based on the disease. And finally, we need to deal with recruitment. Are we going to conduct a clinical trial that comprises all the subpopulations or one specific subpopulation within the pediatric group? We need to deal with cognitive abilities, and this is related to the last point because we need to involve parents. Parents will sign the consent for the participation of these patients or volunteers in clinical trials. And we also need to deal with, let me say, stricter regulations, or we need to keep in mind that here the precautionary principle applies 100%. We need to try, or we will try to avoid any harm to these volunteers. In terms of perspectives, I already mentioned the nanopediatrics program in the Mattel Children's Hospital at UCLA that was founded in 2008, but no progresses have been made so far, I think, because there's nothing new in the web. We have the Australian Centre for Nanomedicine that didn't establish a nanopediatrics program, but one of the leading projects is on neuroblastoma. That is a very recurrent pediatric cancer. And we have the recently founded, say recently in the last 2-3 years, the Center for Pediatric Nanomedicine that was established in Georgia Tech and Emory University in Atlanta. And among the diseases, we have cancer and cystic fibrosis and infectious diseases. And probably we can also take advantage of the existence of different NGOs that are focused on trying to push forward the development of innovative formulations, nano formulations, and I use innovative and nano as equivalents because innovation means trying to improve the performance of the drugs that we use for the treatment. For example, on HIV. So by joining efforts between these two lines of entities, we will probably be able to take this forward in a much more efficient way. My vision is very ethical. I mean, honestly, I cannot see a pediatric patient and say, well, you know, the market is not sufficiently big to trying to develop a better product for you, and thus I'm trying to push this forward. We are a relatively small community, and it's very urgent to increase the number of researchers involved in research at the interface of pediatrics and nanomedicine or micromedicine. And again, this is very well connected or linked to poverty-related diseases, where we also see that patients have been left behind over the last decade or so. So this is the summary. I think that we are currently depending on the progresses made on the adult market of the nanomedicine field, but as far as we will invest efforts to trying to generate a very small consortium of people working in this very specific niche, we will probably be able to find better solutions for these patients. So I think my research group, my funding and collaborators, I thank you for coming so early after such an excellent dinner yesterday night. And now I will introduce the next speakers. Thank you very much.